The apartment carried the scent of failure disguised as temporary arrangement. Walls the color of defeated hope, paint chipped at corners where Maya Torres had stopped caring about aesthetics the same week she'd stopped being able to afford caring. Her daughter Lily, 7 years old with eyes too knowing for childhood, slept on an air mattress that hissed softly with each breath, losing pressure the way everything in their lives seemed to lose pressure. Slowly, inevitably, toward collapse. Maya sat at a kitchen table scarred by previous tenants and counted money that refused to multiply no matter how many times her fingers sorted the bills. $347 between survival and the streets. Rent due in 6 days would cost $1,200. The mathematics allowed no optimism, no creative accounting, no miracle that would transform insufficient into adequate. She'd been a maritime logistics coordinator once, the kind of professional who managed shipping manifests and port documentation for companies moving cargo across oceans. That version of her life had included a husband who left for someone without stretch marks and morning exhaustion, a salary that covered mortgage payments, and the illusion that competence guaranteed security. The industry had collapsed 18 months ago when automation replaced human judgment and AI systems could coordinate global shipping routes faster than teams of experienced professionals. Her severance had lasted 4 months before medical bills from Lily's pneumonia consumed it entirely. Now she worked retail, checkout registers at a discount warehouse, $8 an hour that barely justified the bus fare to get there. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door while she was at work, and Lily was at the free after-school program that served as childcare for parents who couldn't afford actual childcare. 30 days to vacate. Language cold and legal, explaining that missed rent payments violated lease terms and the landlord's patience had limits that Maya's circumstances couldn't extend. Lily woke to the sound of paper rustling, her voice small and trained by experience not to expect good news. "Mama, what's that?" "Just a letter, baby." Her manufactured smile felt like lifting something too heavy. Nothing to worry about. But 7-year-olds who'd learned to read adult expressions knew when reassurance was performance. The mail contained other things: credit card offers for people whose credit hadn't already been destroyed, advertisements for services she couldn't afford, and one envelope that felt different. Heavier paper, embossed letterhead that suggested expense beyond her reach, from a law firm in San Diego called Maritime Asset Recovery Associates. The letter explained in careful legal language that her uncle, Captain Rafael Santos, had died 6 months earlier. Maya barely remembered him, a figure from childhood who'd visited twice before her mother's death, who smelled of salt water and diesel fuel, who'd told stories about ships that had seemed impossibly romantic to a 10-year-old girl. The firm represented his estate, which consisted of a single asset, a decommissioned cargo vessel currently docked at a salvage yard in Long Beach, California. The ship, the MV Esperanza, had been seized by customs officials 15 years ago during an inspection that revealed structural violations and unpaid fees. Rafael had purchased it at government auction for $1, apparently as an investment he'd never had resources to develop. According to maritime law, as his only surviving relative, Maya was being offered the opportunity to claim the vessel. The letter was careful to emphasize that this wasn't a gift, but a burden. The ship required immediate payment of $43,000 in accumulated docking fees, or it would be scrapped within 60 days. If she chose to claim it, she would assume all financial obligations. The Esperanza was described in language that made its condition clear. Rusted hull, non-operational engines, gutted interior, essentially worthless except as scrap metal. The salvage yard had assessed its value at approximately $12,000 if sold for parts, far less than the fees owed. The letter concluded with practical advice. Unless Maya had significant capital to invest in restoration or connections in the maritime salvage industry, the sensible choice was to disclaim the inheritance and let the ship be scrapped. The firm would handle the paperwork. She would own nothing and inherit nothing. A clean break from her uncle's final mistake. Maya read it twice, then a third time, searching for hidden value or missed opportunity. Finding none. Just another dead end in a life that had become a maze of dead ends. Lily peered over her shoulder, sounding out words she recognized. Ship? Uncle Raphael? You had an uncle with a ship? Maya felt something sharp rise in her chest. Not quite grief for a man she'd barely known, but something close. Anger, maybe, at the casual way life distributed opportunities to those with resources while punishing those without. Yes, baby. He had a ship. Had. Past tense, because he died and left behind debt disguised as inheritance. That night, after Lily fell asleep, Maya searched online for information about the MV Esperanza. The ship appeared in maritime databases as a medium-sized cargo vessel, built in 1987, registered in Panama, seized in 2010 for violations that the records didn't specify. Satellite imagery from Long Beach showed it among dozens of other derelict vessels, a rusted hulk with peeling paint and a list to starboard that suggested structural damage. Discussion forums for maritime enthusiasts mentioned it occasionally, always with the same assessment. Beyond salvage, worthless except for scrap, a cautionary tale about buying seized assets without understanding maintenance costs. One forum post caught her attention, dated 3 years earlier, written by someone claiming to have toured the vessel before it was fully closed to public access. The writer described the Esperanza as a time capsule, its interior largely intact despite exterior decay, with cargo holds that still contained abandoned freight from its final voyage. Captain's quarters reportedly preserved exactly as they'd been left when customs officials sealed the ship. The post ended with speculation about why Rafael Santos had bought it, what he'd seen that others missed, whether he'd known something about the vessel's history that made the $1 investment worthwhile. Maya clicked through to the poster's profile, found contact information, sent a message she didn't expect would receive response. Her phone showed 3:17 a.m. when exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep. 23 days until eviction. $43,000 in fees to claim a ship worth $12,000 in scrap. The mathematics remained impossible. The response arrived before dawn, sender identifying himself as Marcus Webb, retired maritime engineer who'd spent 40 years working on cargo vessels and now volunteered at the Long Beach salvage yard documenting decommissioned ships before they were destroyed. His message was longer than Maya expected, written with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a listener for knowledge most people didn't care about. He remembered the Esperanza well, had spent 2 days photographing its interior for historical archives. The ship was indeed beyond practical restoration, but it represented a specific era of cargo transport, a design that had been common in the late 80s before containerization completely transformed the industry. He'd been struck by how complete the preservation was, how little had been looted or vandalized despite years of abandonment. The captain's quarters in particular had fascinated him. Rafael Santos had clearly lived aboard even after the ship was seized, treating it as home until he'd finally been forced out. Personal belongings remained, photographs on walls, books on shelves, a life frozen mid-sentence. Marcus had documented everything, created a digital archive that he'd never found appropriate venue for sharing. If Maya was interested, he'd be happy to show her the photographs, explain what made the Esperanza noteworthy despite its current condition, help her understand what her uncle had seen in a rusted cargo ship that others dismissed as junk. Lily woke to find her mother staring at a phone screen, coffee cold in a mug that advertised a company that no longer existed. "Mama, you didn't sleep. I slept a little, baby." The lie came easily now, protective rather than deceptive. Lily deserved mornings that didn't begin with adult worry. The decision formed without drama, settling into place like something inevitable. Maya would go to Long Beach, would see the ship with her own eyes, would stand where her uncle had stood and understand what he'd been thinking when he'd spent his last dollar on a vessel everyone else considered worthless. Not because she expected to find value, but because walking away without looking felt like a betrayal of family she'd never known well enough to betray properly. The bus to Long Beach cost $48 she couldn't afford. Lily came along because childcare cost more and because 7-year-olds deserved adventures even when adventures were really just desperate mothers grasping at impossible solutions. They left before dawn, riding Greyhound through cities that looked identical in their sprawl, past industrial zones and retail strips and highways that promised destinations they never quite delivered. Lily treated the journey like vacation, pressing her face against the window to watch landscape change from urban to industrial to urban again, asking questions about ships and oceans and uncles she'd never met. Maya answered with fragments of memory, stories her mother had told about Raphael before cancer stole her voice entirely. He'd loved the sea more than land, preferred solitude to company, built a life around movement, because staying still felt like surrender. He'd been strange, her mother had said, unusual, lived far from normal expectations. The salvage yard occupied waterfront property that had probably been valuable before shipping patterns shifted and left ports partially abandoned. Chain-link fence surrounded acres of derelict vessels, some merely old, others actively decomposing. A sign announced visiting hours and strict prohibition against trespassing. The office was a trailer that had survived decades through repairs that created patchwork aesthetic. Marcus Webb met them outside, 70-something with the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime in salt air and engine rooms. He studied Maya with an expression that suggested he was measuring her against Raphael, finding similarities she couldn't see herself. "You look like him. Same eyes, same way of standing like you're on deck, expecting waves." Maya hadn't known what to expect from this meeting, but genealogical observations weren't it. Marcus led them through the yard with the confidence of someone who'd navigated these paths countless times, past ships in various states of decay, explaining the history of vessels whose names meant nothing to Maya but clearly mattered to him. The Esperanza sat near the water's edge, listing 15 degrees to starboard, hull streaked with rust that looked like tears or wounds. Paint that had once been white had weathered to gray, broken only by patches where corrosion had eaten through to bare metal. Up close, the scale became overwhelming. Even a medium-sized cargo ship dwarfed human perspective, rising stories above the waterline, stretching hundreds of feet from bow to stern. Lily grabbed Maya's hand, voice dropping to whisper that suggested awe or fear. "It's so big." Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of someone sharing something precious. 320 feet long, 52-foot beam, designed to carry mixed cargo before containerization made this hull design obsolete. Built in South Korea, registered in Panama, seized in Long Beach after customs inspection revealed she was carrying undeclared cargo, and Captain Santos couldn't produce proper documentation. What kind of cargo? The question emerged before Maya considered whether she wanted to know. Marcus's expression shifted to something harder to read. "That's an interesting question. Official records say miscellaneous freight, but the investigation notes suggest something more specific was suspected but never proven. Your uncle bought her at auction the week after customs released her, paid $1 plus assumption of all fees and debts. Everyone thought he was crazy. They climbed aboard using a gangway that groaned under minimal weight, surfaces slick with moisture and decay. The main deck opened into vastness, cargo hatches sealed with rust, equipment frozen in positions that suggested sudden abandonment. Everything bore the patina of 15 years without maintenance. Metal oxidizing, paint flaking, surfaces yielding to entropy's patient work. The bridge was accessible through a door that resisted before yielding. Inside, controls sat dormant, navigation equipment gutted by salvagers who'd taken anything with resale value. But the space retained its purpose, windows offering 360-degree views of a harbor that had moved on without this vessel. Marcus led them down to the captain's quarters, navigating corridors that grew darker as they descended, using a flashlight that revealed walls sweating condensation and floors buckled by water damage. The quarters occupied the deck below the bridge, a suite of rooms that had been Raphael's entire world. The door was locked with hardware different from other compartments. Marcus produced a key with the reverence of someone handling holy relics. "Your uncle gave this to me 3 years ago, before his health completely failed. Made me promise I'd keep the quarters sealed until his heir came to claim them. said there were things here that mattered, that needed protecting until the right person looked. The lock turned smoothly, maintained even as everything else corroded. The door opened on a space frozen in time, preserved not by intention, but by isolation. The captain's quarters revealed themselves in stages as Maya's eyes adjusted to dim light filtering through portholes crusted with salt and grime. A bedroom with a bunk built into the bulkhead, blankets still rumpled as though Raphael had just risen. A small galley kitchen with dishes in a drying rack, coffee mug bearing the stain of final use. A sitting area with navigation charts covering one wall, marked with routes and notes in handwriting that matched the letter from the law firm. Lily explored with careful steps, touching surfaces lightly as if afraid of disturbing something sacred. Photographs lined the walls, Raphael young and then aging, standing on deck of various ships, always alone, always with the ocean behind him. In one image, he stood beside a woman Maya recognized as her mother, both of them decades younger, smiling with unguarded joy that predated whatever had separated them. Marcus moved to the navigation charts, studying them with professional interest. He was planning routes, even after the ship was seized. Look at these markings. He was calculating fuel consumption, weather patterns, port fees for a voyage that could never happen. Maya joined him, examining her uncle's final project. The routes traced patterns across the Pacific, from Long Beach to ports in Asia and back, optimized for efficiency in ways that suggested deep knowledge of maritime logistics. Notations in the margins calculated costs down to the dollar, mapped refueling stops, identified cargo types that would maximize profit on each leg. It was the work of someone who'd spent a lifetime in this industry, who understood every variable that made shipping profitable or ruinous. But beneath the professional calculations, Maya noticed something else. Certain routes were marked with symbols she didn't recognize, small annotations that didn't match standard maritime notation. Marcus saw her attention shift. Those marks puzzle me too. They're not official chart symbols, more like personal code. The bedroom drew her attention next, its intimacy demanding acknowledgement. Raphael's personal effects remained exactly as he'd left them, clothes in a small closet, books on a shelf built into the bulkhead, a journal on the bedside table. Maya picked up the journal with hands that trembled slightly, opened to pages filled with her uncle's handwriting, entries that began 15 years ago and ended abruptly 6 months before his death. The early entries documented his purchase of the Esperanza, his plans for restoration, his certainty that others had missed something valuable about this vessel. He wrote about the ship's history, its original purpose, the routes it had traveled before seizure. About cargo manifests that didn't quite match inspection records, about documentation that seemed deliberately incomplete. Marcus watched her read, his expression suggesting he knew what the journal contained. Your uncle believed this ship was carrying something specific when it was seized, something customs officials either missed or chose not to disclose. He spent years researching the Esperanza's final voyage, tracking down crew members who'd served aboard, trying to understand why a routine inspection had become seizure and why documentation had disappeared. Maya flipped through pages, Raphael's obsession revealing itself through increasingly detailed entries. He'd interviewed former crew, discovered that the ship's previous captain had died under suspicious circumstances 3 weeks before seizure, learned that several crew members had vanished rather than cooperate with customs investigation. The investigation had been closed without charges filed, ship sold at auction for $1, records sealed under national security provisions that Raphael's FOIA requests couldn't penetrate. He'd become convinced that the Esperanza had been carrying something valuable that had been removed before official inspection, that someone had gotten away with smuggling operation by sacrificing the ship itself. Lily's voice came from across the quarters, calling attention with excitement that 7-year-olds brought to discovery. Mama, this wall feels different. Maya and Marcus turned to find Lily pressing against the bulkhead near the sitting area, her small hands exploring texture that eyes might have missed. The wall panel looked identical to surrounding surfaces, riveted metal painted regulation gray, no obvious seam or distinction. But when Maya placed her own hand where Lily indicated, she felt it too. The panel gave, slightly under pressure, flexing where solid bulkhead should have been rigid. Marcus produced a utility knife from his tool belt, began carefully probing the panel's edges. The rivets weren't rivets at all, just caps painted to match, designed to disguise what was actually a concealed door. Took your daughter's fresh eyes to see what I missed in 2 days of documentation. He worked the false panel free, revealing a compartment perhaps 3 feet square, built into the dead space between the captain's quarters and the adjacent storage room. Inside, wrapped in waterproof canvas and sealed with tape that had somehow survived 15 years of moisture and temperature changes, were bundles stacked with careful precision. Maya's breath caught as Marcus pulled the first bundle free, unwrapped it to reveal what her mind initially refused to process. Currency, U.S. $100 bills bound in bank-issued straps, each strap containing 100 bills, each bundle containing 10 straps. $100,000 per bundle. The compartment held rows of them, stacked 4 deep, 6 across, creating a grid of wealth that made Maya's vision blur with incomprehension. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he checked the next bundle, then the next, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of discovery that exceeded any reasonable expectation. This is easily millions. More bundles beneath these. I can see at least 3 more layers. Lily pressed against Maya's side, her small voice carrying question that demanded answer. Mama, is that real money? Maya's voice came distant, shocked into something approaching dissociation. I think so, baby. I think it's very real. They worked in silence, broken only by breathing and the sound of canvas rustling as Marcus systematically removed bundles, stacking them on Raphael's bunk, counting with the methodical precision of someone who needed concrete numbers to believe what his eyes reported. The final count took 20 minutes that felt suspended outside normal time. $380 million in U.S. currency, bundled in units of 100,000, sealed against elements in a compartment built specifically for concealment. The money appeared genuine, straps bearing bank markings, bills showing were consistent with circulation rather than counterfeiting. Marcus held one bill to the light streaming through portholes, examined watermarks and security features with expertise Maya didn't know retired engineers possessed. These are real, U.S. Treasury printing, security features match period. These were likely printed mid-2000s based on design elements. This isn't counterfeit. This is actual currency. Maya sat heavily on the bunk beside impossible wealth, her mind racing through implications she couldn't quite organize. Her uncle had bought this ship for $1 because he'd understood what was hidden in compartments that customs inspectors had missed or been paid to overlook. The journal entries made sense now. His obsession with the Esperanza's final voyage, his research into the previous captain's death, his certainty that something valuable had been smuggled. He'd found it, or known where it was hidden, had preserved it for 15 years while living in poverty, while dying slowly of disease that better medical care might have treated, while his only niece struggled in circumstances he could have alleviated with a fraction of this fortune. Why didn't he use it? The question emerged as whisper, addressed to memory rather than the people present. Marcus's answer came gentle, weighted with understanding born from years of watching men make choices that defied logic. Because using it meant questions he couldn't answer. This kind of money doesn't appear without source, without documentation, without trail that authorities follow. Your uncle was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that spending smuggled currency would bring exactly the investigation he'd spent years avoiding. So, he waited, preserved it, hoped that eventually circumstances would change, or the right heir would know what to do with inheritance that couldn't be claimed through normal channels. Lily's small hand found Maya's, squeezing with pressure that anchored her to present reality. We're rich. The innocence of the question, the simple equation of money equals security, broke something in Maya's chest. Not quite that simple, baby. But we're going to be okay. Yes, we're going to be okay. The enormity of what they'd found settled over the captain's quarters like weight, pressing against certainty and flooding with questions that would demand answers. $380 million hidden aboard a derelict cargo ship. A fortune that had waited 15 years for discovery, protected by her uncle's silence and the simple fact that no one looked carefully at vessels everyone assumed were worthless. Maya's hands moved through the money with detachment, touching bills that represented more wealth than her entire extended family had earned across generations. Each bundle was $100,000, more than she'd made in 3 years of retail work, more than her severance and unemployment combined. There were 3,800 bundles. The number was too large to feel real. Marcus had moved to the navigation charts, studying them with new understanding. These symbols, he traced the notations Raphael had made, their coordinates, specific locations where your uncle planned to, I don't know, move the money perhaps, convert it, legitimize it somehow. Maya joined him, following her uncle's logic across Pacific routes. Each mark point corresponded to a port with specific characteristics, loose customs enforcement, banking systems known for privacy, jurisdictions where large cash transactions wouldn't trigger immediate investigation. Raphael had been planning, not just preserving, mapping a future where this money could be transformed from criminal proceeds into legitimate assets. But the plan required a functioning ship, resources to execute complex financial maneuvers, connections that a dying man living in poverty couldn't maintain. So, the money had stayed hidden, waiting for someone else to inherit both fortune and problem. The sound of vehicles approaching cut through Maya's racing thoughts. Marcus moved to the porthole, tension visible in his shoulders. Company, salvage yard owner, and looks like police. Someone must have seen us board. Maya's pulse spiked with adrenaline that made her hands shake. The money they can't find. Her mind spun through scenarios, each worse than the last. Discovery meant seizure, investigation into source, questions she couldn't answer, money she couldn't claim, back to the apartment and eviction and nothing. Marcus was already moving, shoving bundles back into the compartment with efficiency that suggested he'd anticipated this exact situation. Help me. We need everything back exactly as it was, canvas rewrapped, panel sealed, no evidence we found anything. Maya and Lily worked frantically, their hands moving bundles that felt heavier now that they understood what they represented. The false panel slid back into place with a sound like fate closing. Marcus produced a small tube of paint from his kit, touched up edges where the knife had scratched, stepped back to examine his work. Can't tell it was disturbed unless you know exactly where to look. Footsteps echoed on the deck above, voices calling into corridors that amplified sound. Marcus met Maya's eyes with intensity that demanded truth. You need to decide right now what you're doing. If you claim this ship, you assume all debts, including $43,000 in docking fees you can't possibly pay. If you walk away, it gets scrapped in 60 days, and that money gets destroyed or more likely found by someone else who knows how to use it. The choice required certainty Maya didn't possess, decision-making at a speed that felt like violence. $43,000 against $380 million. Debt she couldn't afford against wealth she couldn't explain. Lily's college fund against federal prison. Security against catastrophe. The voices grew closer, multiple people now, flashlights visible through doorways. Maya heard herself speak, the words emerging from some place deeper than conscious thought. I claim the ship. Whatever that means, whatever comes next, this is mine now, my uncle left it to me, and I'm not walking away. Marcus nodded once, something like approval crossing his weathered face. Then we tell them you're here to inspect your inheritance. Nothing more. You haven't decided what to do yet. You're considering options. The captain's quarters are locked, and you don't have the key. He pocketed the key with the smooth motion of someone accustomed to small deceptions. The salvage yard owner arrived first. A man perhaps 50 whose expression suggested he'd learned to expect the worst from people claiming derelict vessels. Name's Dennis Crawford. You're Raphael Santos' heir? Maya stood straighter, summoning authority from some reserve she discovered in the last 10 minutes. Maya Torres, yes, he was my uncle. I'm here to see what he left me. The police officer behind Crawford looked bored, present because protocol required it, not because he expected problems. Just need to confirm you have legal right to be aboard, ma'am. Marcus provided documents from a law firm, explained that Maya had contacted him as the salvage yard's volunteer historian to get information about the Esperanza's condition. Everything above board, nothing unusual except a woman trying to understand inheritance that looked more like burden. Crawford's attention swept the captain's quarters with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen countless vessels stripped and abandoned. Door was locked when we boarded. How'd you get in? Marcus didn't hesitate. It wasn't locked. Door must have been secured improperly last time. Swung open when I tested it, just documenting the interior for Ms. Torres before she makes decisions. The lie was smooth, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how much truth to shade. The officer peered into the quarters, saw nothing except personal effects and outdated navigation equipment. Ma'am, you understand this vessel has outstanding fees of $43,000? Unless those are paid in full, the ship will be scrapped in 56 days. Maya forced her voice to remain steady. I'm aware. I'm still evaluating my options. The bureaucratic answer satisfied the officer, who had paperwork to complete and more pressing matters than one more derelict vessel in a yard full of them. Crawford looked less convinced, studying Maya with an expression that suggested he'd learned to read people through decades of watching them make poor decisions about maritime assets. Your uncle spent 15 years fighting to keep this ship from scrap, paid minimum fees to prevent immediate seizure, but never enough to actually move or restore it. Died hoping someone would see value everyone else missed. You look like you're in about the same position he was, except younger and with a kid to worry about. My advice? Walk away. Take whatever personal effects you want, sign the disclaimer, let us scrap it, and move on with your life. The advice was practical, probably kind in its way, delivered by someone who'd seen too many people throw good money after bad into vessels beyond saving. If Maya had asked for this counsel yesterday, she would have taken it gratefully. Today, with $380 million sealed behind false bulkhead 10 feet away, the suggestion felt like asking her to abandon salvation itself. I appreciate the advice. I need a few days to think. Crawford shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd learned not to argue with determined stupidity. Your call. Office closes at 5. You need to be off ship by then. After they left, the silence in the captain's quarters felt heavy. With implication, Maya stood amid her uncle's preserved life, surrounded by evidence of his obsession, guardian now of wealth that couldn't be claimed without answering questions that had no safe answers. Marcus broke the quiet with practical observation. The money's hidden well enough to survive another inspection, but eventually this ship gets scrapped. They'll find it when they cut it apart for salvage. You've got maybe 2 months before that happens, less if you can't pay fees. Maya's mind was already working through logistics, her years in maritime coordination providing framework that desperation sharpened into plan. 2 months to do what? Convert $380 million in probably smuggled currency into legitimate assets? That's impossible. Marcus smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for the right question. Not impossible, just very, very difficult and definitely illegal. But I spent 40 years in this industry. I know people who move cargo that isn't officially moving, banks and jurisdictions that don't ask questions they don't want answered, maritime law well enough to navigate waters your uncle started charting. The offer hung in salt air between them, assistance from someone who should have been calling authorities, instead proposing conspiracy. Maya studied him, tried to understand motivation that would make a retired engineer risk everything to help a stranger. Why would you do this? Marcus looked at the photographs of Raphael on the walls, at the navigation charts mapping dreams that had died unrealized, at Lily exploring the quarters with childhood wonder. Because Rafael Santos was a good man who made one mistake and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Because you're his family and you deserve better than he got. Because I'm 73 years old with nothing to lose and one last chance to do something that matters. And because, honestly, figuring out how to legitimize $380 million sounds like the most interesting problem I've had in 2 decades of retirement. Lily had found a music box in one of Raphael's drawers, the mechanical kind that played tinny melody when wound. She brought it to Maya, held it up with the trust that her mother would share in small joys, even when everything was complicated. "Listen, Mama. It's pretty." The sound filled the captain's quarters. Simple tune that had probably comforted Raphael during years of isolation, anchored to beauty in spaces designed for function. Maya wounded again, watching Lily's face light up with pleasure that required no money, no scheme, no desperate gamble. This was what mattered, preserving her daughter's capacity for wonder, protecting childhood from adult catastrophe, ensuring that 7-year-old girls could find music boxes pretty without understanding the context of their discovery. She looked at Marcus, at the man who'd just offered to become co-conspirator in something that could destroy them both. If we do this, Lily stays safe. No matter what happens, she can't be implicated, can't be at risk, can't pay for my decisions. Marcus nodded with solemnity that suggested he understood exactly what was being asked. Agreed. Now we need to move fast. First step is claiming the ship officially, filing paperwork that establishes you as legal owner. That gives us time and legitimacy. Second step is dealing with the $43,000 in fees. Third step is much more complicated. Maya's laugh came bitter. I have $347. How exactly do I pay $43,000? There are ways. Marcus moved to Raphael's desk, began pulling documents from drawers. Maritime lien law is complex. You can file for payment plan, contest the fees, argue for reduction based on ship's condition. Bureaucracy moves slowly, and we can use that. By time while we work the real problem. The real problem being how to transform probable smuggling proceeds into money she could actually use without triggering investigation that would send her to federal prison. When stated plainly, the impossibility of it made Maya's chest tight with panic that threatened to overwhelm the fragile determination she'd been building. This is insane. I'm a retail worker with an eviction notice. I don't know how to smuggle money or evade federal investigation or whatever this requires. Logistics, Marcus countered. You understand shipping manifests, port documentation, customs procedures, that knowledge transfers. We just apply it to different cargo. Plus you have something your uncle never had. You have me, and I have contacts who can help. The practical optimism felt surreal. Discussion of federal crimes conducted in the same matter-of-fact tone as discussing weather or shipping schedules. But Maya found herself nodding, accepting complicity in something she didn't fully understand, driven by desperation and the particular madness that comes from having nothing to lose being offered everything to gain. They left the Esperanza as the sun dropped toward the Pacific, painting the salvage yard in shades of amber and rust. Lily held Maya's hand, skipping between them with the resilience of childhood that could process impossible discovery and return to simple movement. In her other hand, she carried the music box, Raphael's small gift to great niece he'd never met, inheritance more precious than money because it required no explanation. The bus ride back felt different from the morning journey, weighted with knowledge that changed everything. Maya watched industrial landscape blur past windows and tried to imagine how $347 became $43,000 became legitimate access to $380 million. The mathematics remained impossible, but the variables had changed. She had help now, a partner in crime who was actual criminal or about to become one alongside her. Marcus had given her his number, promised to call with next steps, warned her that what came next would require trust and nerve in equal measure. The apartment greeted them with familiar defeat, walls the same color, air mattress still slowly leaking, eviction notice on the counter where she'd left it. But Maya looked at it differently now, saw 28 remaining days not as countdown to disaster, but as timeline for executing plan that would either save them or destroy them more completely than eviction ever could. Lily was asleep within an hour, exhausted by travel and discovery, curled around the music box like treasure she'd been gifted rather than found. Maya sat at the kitchen table and did what she'd always done when facing impossible problems. She made lists, organized chaos into manageable steps, created structure from overwhelming complexity. Pay $43,000 in docking fees, legitimate the money, protect Lily, don't go to prison. The list looked absurd written plainly, tasks that belonged in heist movies rather than single mother's action items. But beneath the absurdity lay framework, process that could be broken into smaller component pieces, each impossible step divided into merely very difficult substeps. Her phone buzzed with message from Marcus, sent encrypted through app she'd never used before, but he'd insisted she'd download. Talk to contact in Cayman Islands. Possible route for initial conversion. Need decisions fast. 43,000 buys us time. 380 million buys everything else. You in? Maya's fingers hovered over the keyboard, typing and deleting responses, trying to find words that matched the enormity of committing to conspiracy. Finally, she settled on simplicity. I'm in. The response came immediately. Good. Tomorrow we start. Bring Lily to friend's house if you can. This conversation requires privacy and focus you can't maintain with 7-year-old present. Sleep tonight. Last easy sleep you'll have for a while. Maya set the phone down, looked at her daughter sleeping peacefully, at the eviction notice that meant nothing now, at walls that had felt like prison but might just become starting point for escape beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd woken up this morning. The enormity of what she'd agreed to settled over her like weight, pressing against certainty, flooding doubt into space where determination needed to hold. $380 million hidden aboard a ship everyone thought was worthless. A fortune that had waited 15 years for her uncle to use it and another 6 months for her to find it. Money that could solve every problem or create new catastrophes that would make current struggles look trivial by comparison. She thought about Raphael, dying alone, protecting secrets he could never benefit from, waiting for heir he'd never met to be brave enough or desperate enough to finish what he'd started. Wondered what he'd think of her now, his niece ready to commit federal crimes to claim inheritance he'd hidden, whether he'd approve or try to warn her away. The music box sat on the counter where Lily had left it, melody silent but present, reminder that some things had value beyond money. Maya wound it once more. Let the simple tune fill quiet apartment, anchored to beauty in moment that felt balanced between catastrophe and salvation. Tomorrow she would begin journey that would either transform their lives or destroy them. Tonight she sat in familiar defeat and tried to imagine becoming the kind of person who could successfully smuggle $380 million past federal authorities and financial systems designed specifically to prevent exactly what she was planning. The impossibility of it should have sent her running towards safer choices, should have made her sign disclaimer, walk away from the Esperanza and its deadly fortune, accept poverty as preferable to prison. But desperation had its own logic, and mothers protecting daughters found courage in places that safety could never access. She'd spent 2 years losing ground despite working constantly, watching Lily grow up in circumstances that stole childhood's ease, knowing that every small joy came at costs she could barely afford. The system wasn't designed to let people like her succeed, just to maintain them at level where they couldn't quite fall through completely, but could never climb high enough to matter. Raphael's hidden fortune represented more than money. It was possibility, agency, the power to write different ending to story that had seemed determined to conclude in defeat. If using it meant breaking laws written to protect wealth that was already protected, if it meant becoming criminal to escape poverty that was itself violence, then she would break laws and become criminal and hope that the protection she could buy for Lily would justify whatever came after. Marcus's apartment occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had witnessed Long Beach's maritime decline, walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing about money and relationships and all the small catastrophes that accumulated into lives. He'd cleared his dining table of engineering manuals and nautical charts, replaced them with documentation that mapped their impossible task. Financial routing diagrams, offshore banking structures, shell company frameworks, the architecture of money laundering rendered in careful diagrams that might have been innocuous if context didn't make them criminal. Maya arrived at 8 in the morning. Lily deposited with a neighbor who ran an informal childcare service and asked no questions about sudden schedule changes. The woman had looked at Maya with the knowing sympathy of someone who recognized desperation, charged $20 Maya couldn't afford, but paid anyway, because some costs couldn't be negotiated. Marcus had coffee ready, strong enough to strip paint, serve in mugs that advertised shipping companies that no longer existed. He gestured toward the table with the casualness of someone discussing grocery shopping rather than federal conspiracy. First problem is immediate. $43,000 in docking fees. We can't pay it legitimately without raising questions about sudden capital access. Can't use the hidden money directly because serial numbers might be tracked. So we need bridge financing from source that won't scrutinize origin. Maya studied the diagrams, her background in logistics helping her recognize patterns in the complex routing. This looks like you're suggesting we borrow against the ship itself. Marcus smiled with approval. Exactly. Maritime lien law allows for loans secured against vessel value. The Esperanza is officially worth $12,000 as scrap, but we can argue. Restoration potential, historical value, premium for intact cargo vessel in era when most have been containerized. Find the right lender. We can secure a loan for $50,000. The right lender meaning someone who doesn't ask questions. Marcus's expression acknowledged the truth without flinching. I know a guy. Runs private maritime investment fund. Specializes in distressed assets, understands that some opportunities require flexible interpretation of regulations. He'll want interest rate that would make loan sharks blush, but he'll give us the capital and the time we need. And when we can't pay him back with legitimate income, then we use the hidden money. But by that point, it won't be hidden money anymore. It'll be legitimized through process I'm about to explain, which is where things get significantly more illegal. He pulled up a document on his laptop, financial flowchart that tracked money through a maze of jurisdictions and corporate entities. The initial conversion happens in the Cayman Islands. Contact their runs exchange service for. Let's call it gray market currency, high-volume cash transactions that get converted to wire transfers for a fee of 8%. Maya's mental math calculated the cost. 8% of $380 million is over $30 million. That's robbery. That's the cost of making dirty money appear clean, Marcus countered. Once it's wired funds instead of physical currency, we can move it through shell corporations, each transfer creating additional documentation distance from the source. By the time it reaches accounts we control, the trail is so complex that tracing origin requires resources most investigators won't deploy for what looks like legitimate offshore investment activity. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she traced the routing diagram. Following money through corporations in Belize, trusts in the Cook Islands, investment vehicles in Singapore, each step adding legitimacy while obscuring source. Her entire career had been built on understanding exactly these kinds of logistics, manifests, and documentation, and the movement of assets through systems designed to track everything. Now, she was learning to weaponize that knowledge against the very frameworks she'd once served. How do we physically move $380 million in cash to the Cayman Islands without getting caught? That's the elegance of it. Marcus zoomed in on a section of the diagram. We don't move it all at once. We move it the way your uncle originally planned, using the ship itself. The Esperanza can be made seaworthy enough for one final voyage with about $15,000 in repairs. Engine work, hull patches, nothing fancy, just functional enough to reach international waters. Once we're outside U.S. jurisdiction, we transfer the cargo to a vessel my contact provides. They handle transport to the Cayman conversion point. We receive wire transfers over the following weeks as they process the currency in batches small enough to avoid triggering international reporting requirements. Maya felt her breakfast rise in her throat, nausea mixing with adrenaline. You're talking about smuggling $380 million out of U.S. waters. That's so many felonies I can't even count them. If we get caught, I'm not just going to prison. I'm never seeing Lily again. Marcus met her eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd already calculated risks and accepted them. Yes, if we get caught, consequences are catastrophic. But if we don't try, you lose everything anyway. The ship gets scrapped in 54 days. The money gets found by salvage crews who will report it or keep it. Either way, you get nothing. Your eviction stance. Lily grows up watching you work retail until your body gives out. This is high risk, but it's the only route with high reward. The calculus was brutal and honest. Maya had spent her entire adult life playing by rules that had rewarded her with poverty and abandonment. The system she'd trusted had automated her job, denied her unemployment extensions, priced healthcare beyond affordability, and now threatened to make her daughter homeless. Raphael had understood this, had taken $1 and bet everything on the possibility that rules existed to be circumvented by those desperate or brave enough to try. Walk me through the timeline. Her voice came steadier than she felt. If we do this, what's the sequence? Marcus pulled up a detailed project plan that would have impressed her old logistics team. Days 1 through 5, we secure the bridge loan, file paperwork claiming the Esperanza, establish legal ownership, and begin minimum necessary repairs. Days 6 through 15, we organize the offshore infrastructure, shell companies, banking relationships, transport coordination. Days 16 through 25, we make the ship seaworthy, load provisions, prepare for departure. Day 26, we sail. The simplicity of the final step belied its enormity. Sailing meant committing fully, crossing into waters where turning back became impossible, where discovery meant consequences that would destroy everything. Maya thought about Lily, about the music box she'd fallen asleep clutching, about 7-year-old trust that her mother would keep her safe. If I do this, Lily can't be anywhere near it. She stays on land, stays with someone who can care for her if things go wrong. She doesn't know details, doesn't become accessory. Marcus nodded with understanding that seemed almost paternal. Already arranged. My daughter lives in San Diego, teaches elementary school, has guest room, and would be happy to host Lily for what we'll tell her is an extended business trip you're taking to settle your uncle's estate. She'll ask no questions, provide stable environment, and if worst happens, she'll make sure Lily gets placed with family services in a way that protects her from being associated with your activities. The provision for failure, the acknowledgement that this might end with Maya in federal custody and her daughter requiring protection from the fallout, made the whole enterprise feel suddenly real in a way that diagrams and timelines hadn't. She was actually considering this, actually planning to become the kind of criminal that news reports covered with footage of handcuffed defendants being led into courthouses. But the alternative was what? Accept defeat, return to the apartment, and wait for eviction? Spend the next 20 years watching Lily grow up poor because her mother had been too afraid to risk everything on one desperate gamble? I need to think. Maya stood abruptly, the walls of Marcus's apartment suddenly too close, air too thin. I need a few hours to process. Marcus didn't argue, simply provided his number again and reminded her that time was asset they couldn't afford to waste. Every day we delay reduces margin for error and increases the chance someone else discovers what you found. The ship gets inspected regularly. Luck that protected the money for 15 years won't hold indefinitely. Maya walked Long Beach Harbor for hours, watching container ships load and unload cargo with automated precision that had made her profession obsolete. The irony wasn't lost on her. Technology had eliminated her legitimate career. Now she was planning to use that same expertise for activities that would make her unemployable in any legal capacity if caught. But she'd be rich. That was the seductive logic that kept circling through her thoughts. $380 million, even after conversion fees and expenses and Marcus's cut, still left enough that Lily would never worry about money again. College fully funded, medical care accessible, security that poverty couldn't touch. All she had to do was commit multiple felonies, successfully evade federal law enforcement, and maintain operational security for a conspiracy that required perfection across dozens of moving parts. Simple. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, suspicion trained by years of bill collectors, making silence preferable to conversation. But something made her accept the call, voice cautious. "Hello, Ms. Torres. This is Dennis Crawford from the salvage yard." The voice carried tension that immediately set her nerves on edge. "We need to talk about your uncle's ship. There's been a development." Maya's pulse spiked with adrenaline that made her hands shake. "What kind of development?" "Someone filed a claim against the Esperanza this morning. Maritime lien from a creditor who says Rafael Santos owed him money for services rendered. They're trying to force immediate sale to satisfy the debt. If their claim is valid, the ship goes to auction next week. Your inheritance rights become subordinate to creditor satisfaction. The news hit like physical impact, timeline that was already tight, compressing to impossible. Who filed the claim? Crawford hesitated, the pause suggesting he was reading from documents that complicated simple answer. Company called Pacific Maritime Services, represented by attorney named Walter Chun, claiming Raphael owed them $78,000 for engine repairs and maintenance conducted over 5 years. Never paid. Interest accumulated. They've got documentation. Seems legitimate on surface. Maya's mind raced through possibilities, probabilities, the timing that felt too convenient to be coincidental. Someone knew, or suspected, or had been watching for exactly this moment when Raphael's heir emerged and might actually claim the vessel. The creditor claim was either legitimate coincidence or strategic move to force the ship into sale before she could secure it. Either way, it accelerated everything catastrophically. How long do I have to contest the claim? 7 days to file objection and provide evidence the debt is invalid or already satisfied. Otherwise, auction proceeds automatically. Creditors get paid from sale price. Anything remaining comes to you, which based on 12,000 scrap value minus 78,000 debt means you get nothing and still owe the difference. Maya thanked him, ended the call, immediately dialed Marcus with hands that shook hard enough that she misdialed twice before connecting. We have a problem, she explained the creditor claim, the compressed timeline, the threat of losing everything before they could even begin. Marcus's response came quick and certain, the decisiveness of someone who'd been waiting for complications. This could be legitimate, or it could be someone who knows what's hidden and is trying to force the ship into sale where they can acquire it themselves. Either way, we can't wait. We move now. Today. This afternoon. We secure the bridge loan, file your claim paperwork, and establish legal ownership before anyone can interfere. The objection to the creditor claim buys us the 7 days we need to get repairs done and make the ship seaworthy. 7 days. Maya's voice came hollow with the impossibility of it. You said we needed 26. I said that was the safe timeline. Desperate timeline is 7 days if we cut corners, work around the clock, and accept higher risk of mechanical failure during the voyage. Your uncle kept detailed maintenance logs. I've reviewed them. The Esperanza's engines are salvageable. Hull integrity is compromised but patchable. We can make her seaworthy enough for one trip if we're willing to bet our lives she holds together. Maya thought about Lily, about the music box, about federal prison, and about poverty that was its own kind of prison with longer sentences and no possibility of parole. Okay, she heard herself say. Okay, let's do it. Let's do all of it. Now. The bridge loan came through by evening, Marcus's contact proving as flexible about documentation as promised. $50,000 wired to an account opened that afternoon in Maya's name. Interest rate of 24% that would have been criminal if maritime lien law didn't exempt certain transactions from usury statutes. The money felt simultaneously real and abstract. Numbers on a screen that represented more cash than she'd ever controlled, but less than 0.1% of what waited hidden aboard the Esperanza. She paid the docking fees immediately. $43,000 transferred to the salvage yard's account with satisfaction that came from knowing this was the last legitimate transaction she might make for a long time. The remaining $7,000 went to initial repair supplies and the attorney, a woman named Sandra Kim, who specialized in obscure maritime law, listened to Maya's explanation of the creditor claim with the skeptical expression of someone who'd heard every possible lie about debt and obligation. You're saying your uncle never mentioned this $78,000 debt to you? Maya met her gaze without flinching, lying becoming easier when stakes were high enough. He never mentioned any debts. We weren't close. I'm learning about his affairs as I go. Sandra made notes on her tablet, stylus moving with practiced efficiency. The documentation Pacific Maritime Services provided looks legitimate on surface. Invoices, work orders, correspondence, but it's possible to fabricate maritime paperwork if you know the right formats. I'll file objection claiming the debt is disputed and demanding proof of service delivery. That triggers review process that takes minimum 7 days, maximum 30 if we can extend it. 7 is all we need. The attorney's expression sharpened with curiosity that Maya tried to deflect. You're planning to do what with the ship in 7 days? Repairs sufficient to move it to a facility where restoration can proceed properly. Maya delivered the lie smoothly, amazed at her own capacity for deception. The Esperanza has historical value. I'm exploring options for preservation rather than scrap. Sandra's skepticism was visible but professional. She'd been paid her retainer. Clients' motivations were not her concern as long as fees cleared. I'll file the paperwork this evening. You'll have your 7 days. Use them wisely. That night Maya couldn't sleep. Lying on the air mattress that had deflated completely, staring at ceiling tiles that water damage had stained into abstract patterns. Lily breathed evenly beside her, untroubled by adult anxieties, trusting that her mother's tense energy was just normal stress rather than prelude to criminal conspiracy. Maya's phone glowed with messages from Marcus, repair schedules and supply lists and coordination details that read like military operation planning. They'd start work at dawn, hiring day laborers who asked no questions about sudden urgency, paying cash for speed rather than concerning themselves with permits or inspections. The Esperanza would be functional in 7 days, or it wouldn't, but either way they committed to a timeline that allowed no hesitation. She thought about her uncle, about Raphael spending 15 years protecting money he couldn't use, dying in poverty while sitting on fortune that might have saved him. The waste of it, the terrible discipline required to preserve something for others when you yourself are suffering, it spoke to either nobility or madness, and Maya wasn't sure which. Perhaps they were the same thing. Perhaps nobility was just madness that served someone other than yourself. The work began before sunrise. Marcus arriving with a crew of 4 men whose weathered faces suggested decades of maritime labor and the wisdom not to ask questions about jobs that paid triple normal rates in cash. They descended into the Esperanza's engine room, a cathedral of rusted machinery and sea systems that hadn't functioned in 15 years. The chief engineer, a man who introduced himself only as Santos, studied the engines with an expression somewhere between reverence and disbelief. These are old girls, good bones, but neglect like this usually means terminal damage. We'll know in a few hours whether resurrection is possible or if we're wasting time on corpse. Maya watched them work, their competence in alien environment making her feel useless. Her expertise was logistics and documentation, not the physical labor of mechanical resurrection. But Marcus found roles for her, organizing supplies, coordinating with parts suppliers, managing the timeline that seemed to compress with each passing hour. Lily was delivered to Marcus's daughter Elena at noon, the handoff happening at a cafe in San Diego with casual efficiency that belied its significance. Elena was 40-something with a warm competence of an elementary school teacher accustomed to managing children and chaos simultaneously. She knelt to Lily's eye level, voice gentle. Your mom tells me you're going to stay with me for a week while she handles some business with your uncle's ship. That sound okay? Lily looked between Elena and Maya, 7-year-old intuition sensing something unspoken but trusting that her mother's decisions were made with her welfare in mind. Will there be other kids? Elena smiled. My daughter Sophie is 9. She's excited to meet you. I think you'll get along great. Maya hugged Lily with intensity that threatened to crack her composure, whispering promises she wasn't certain she could keep. I love you, baby. I'll call every night. Be good for Miss Elena. When I'm done with this business trip, things are going to be different. Better. I promise. The drive back to Long Beach felt like cutting an anchor line, setting herself adrift from the only thing that truly mattered in service of a gamble that might give Lily everything or take away even the little they had. Marcus drove in silence, understanding that some moments required no commentary, giving Maya space to process the enormity of what she'd just done. Back at the ship, Santos had news that was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Engines are salvageable, he announced, hands black with grease, face showing satisfaction of someone who'd won an argument with machinery. Going to need new fuel injectors, cooling system overhaul, electrical rewiring, and about 40 hours of labor per engine. But the blocks are sound, compression is better than expected, and your uncle maintained lubrication even when the ship was seized, which prevented the kind of seizure that would make this impossible. Can you do it in 6 days? Maya's question carried weight of everything depending on his answer. Santos looked at his crew, at the engines, at the impossible task. With this team, working 20-hour shifts and about 15,000 in parts? Yeah, we can do it. Maybe. 70% confidence, which is better odds than I usually work with on resurrection jobs like this. Maya authorized the spending without hesitation. The bridge loan bleeding away into parts and labor and materials that transformed the Esperanza from derelict into something approaching functional. The hull repairs proceeded simultaneously. Welders sealing breaches where corrosion had eaten through metal, patches applied with more concern for water tightness than aesthetics. The ship would never be beautiful again, but beauty wasn't the objective. One voyage, that was all she needed to survive. One trip into international waters where cargo could be transferred and fortune could begin its transformation from criminal proceeds to legitimate wealth. The offshore infrastructure came together with speed that suggested Marcus had been planning this longer than he'd admitted. Shell corporations appeared in Belize and the Cayman Islands, their incorporation documents filed by attorneys who specialized in privacy-focused entity formation. Bank accounts opened in jurisdictions that value discretion over transparency. The routing that would transform physical currency into wire transfers was established through contacts Marcus described vaguely as people who'd spent careers moving money that didn't want to be traced. Maya signed documents she barely understood, creating corporate structures that existed only on paper, directors who were paid nominees, shareholders who were trusts controlled by other trusts in infinite regression designed to obscure beneficial ownership. The complexity was intentional, each layer adding distance between her and the source of funds, each entity creating plausible deniability that might survive investigation if investigations came. The conversion would happen in stages. Marcus explained while they reviewed documentation in the captain's quarters that had become their operation center. First batch of currency gets transported to the Cayman contact. They verify authenticity, process it through their exchange network, wire equivalent value minus their 8% fee to the Belize Corporation. That corporation then invests in the Cook Islands Trust, which distributes funds to the Singapore investment vehicle, which eventually flows back to holding companies we control. By the time the money reaches accounts we can actually access, it's been documented as investment returns, dividend distributions, legitimate financial activity. The beautiful part is that each jurisdiction has different reporting requirements and different treaty obligations. Connecting the dots requires international cooperation that rarely happens for anything less than terrorism or state-level corruption. Maya studied the flow chart, her mind mapping the route money would take from the hidden compartment in Raphael's quarters to accounts she could use to pay for Lily's college and health care and everything poverty had denied them. The ingenuity of it was impressive and horrifying in equal measure. Financial engineering deployed, not for corporate profit maximization, but for personal enrichment through circumvention of systems designed to prevent exactly this activity. How many times have you done this before? The question emerged before she considered whether she wanted the answer. Marcus's expression remained carefully neutral. Never at this scale. But I've helped move problematic cargo through problematic channels often enough to understand the principles. Money's just another cargo type, heavier than most, subject to more scrutiny, but fundamentally it's the same logistics problem. Get from point A to point B without authorities understanding what's moving or why. The engines came to life on day 4 with a sound like resurrection. Diesel roar that echoed across the salvage yard and brought Dennis Crawford running, with expression mixing alarm and disbelief. Santos stood in the engine room, grinning with the satisfaction of someone who'd bet against long odds and won. Both engines operational, he announced over the noise. Not pretty, not efficient, but functional enough for what you need. Cooling systems holding, electrical stable, we've got propulsion. The hull patches were completed by day 5. Welds inspected by maritime surveyor Marcus had bribed to overlook the rushed timeline and questionable workmanship. The surveyors signed off with the explicit caveat that his certification was for limited coastal transit only, that the vessel was not approved for extended ocean voyage, that any captain who took her into deep water was accepting significant risk of catastrophic failure. Maya signed the acknowledgement, accepting responsibility for whatever came next, knowing that the voyage she was planning exceeded the surveyor's limited authorization by margins that would make insurance companies laugh if they knew. But insurance required disclosure and honesty, luxuries she could no longer afford. Day 6 brought the crew. 3 men Marcus had recruited from networks of maritime workers who valued cash over questions. The captain, introduced as simply Robertson, was 60-something with the sun-damaged skin of someone who'd spent a lifetime at sea and the careful neutrality of someone who understood that some voyages existed outside official channels. He toured the Esperanza with professional assessment that cataloged every flaw and compromise. "She'll make it to international waters," he concluded, "but I wouldn't bet on much beyond that. Engine failure, hull breach, navigation system malfunction. We've got redundancy on none of the critical systems. This is a one-way trip for the ship. We complete the cargo transfer, and this lady goes to the bottom or back to scrap. Understood?" Maya met his gaze without flinching. "Understood. The cargo transfer is all that matters. After that, the Esperanza can sink for all I care." Robertson's expression suggested approval of her pragmatism. "Then we'll get along fine. My crew knows their jobs. We don't ask questions about what we're moving or why. We execute the voyage, complete the transfer, and collect our fee. 75,000, paid on completion. Half to me, the rest split among my people." Maya had expected the number would be high, but 75,000 still made her breath catch. The expenses were accumulating faster than her mental accounting could track. Bridge loan, 50,000. Docking fees, 43,000. Repairs, 15,000. Crew, 75,000. Legal fees, 5,000. Miscellaneous supplies and bribes, another 10,000. She was nearly 200,000 into this venture before accounting for the conversion fees that would consume 30 million more. But 200,000 against 380 million still left resources that would transform their lives so completely that the spending felt justified despite every rational voice screaming that she was in over her head. The final preparation was emotional rather than logistical. Maya called Lily that evening, the phone conversation filled with 7-year-old updates about playing with Sophie and learning new games, and the teacher-like way Elena explained things. "Mama, when are you coming back?" The question carried no anxiety, just curiosity from a child whose sense of time was still developing. "Soon, baby. Just a few more days. I'm almost done with the work on Uncle Raphael's ship. Are you being good?" Lily's affirmative came with a kind of elaborate detail that suggested truth. Elena had been good to her, patient with questions, gentle with homesickness, providing stability that Maya's chaotic life had rarely offered. The guilt of that realization sat heavy. Her daughter was flourishing in someone else's care because that care came with resources Maya couldn't provide. Food that wasn't calculated by cost per calorie, activities that didn't require choosing between enrichment and electricity bills, attention from an adult who wasn't chronically exhausted by survival's demands. If this voyage succeeded, Maya could provide those things herself. If it failed, at least Lily would have this week of normalcy to remember. After the call ended, she sat in the captain's quarters that had become temporary home, surrounded by Raphael's preserved life and the evidence of his long wait. The hidden compartment remained sealed, its contents untouched since their initial discovery. Tomorrow, they would begin loading provisions for the voyage. Day after tomorrow, they would sail. The timeline that had seemed impossible when Marcus first proposed, it had somehow been achieved through cash and determination and the willingness to cut corners that safety regulations existed to prevent. Marcus found her there, brought coffee that was more ritual than caffeine requirement. Tomorrow we load food, water, fuel, everything we need for a 3-day voyage. Day after, we leave at dawn, navigate out of Long Beach Harbor under coastal transit authorization, make for international waters. The transfer vessel will meet us at coordinates I provided. They'll offload the cargo. We'll scuttle the Esperanza if necessary, and everyone comes home via the transfer ship. You'll be back in San Diego within a week. Lily will never have known you were in danger, and the money will start flowing through the conversion pipeline. Maya wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, seeking warmth that seemed to have left her body despite California climate. What's the worst-case scenario? Realistically, Marcus didn't insult her with false optimism. Worst case, we get intercepted by Coast Guard during the voyage, ship gets boarded, cargo gets discovered, everyone on board gets arrested for smuggling and money laundering. You're looking at 20 years federal minimum mandatory sentencing. Lily goes into foster system. I die in prison given my age. The crew gets prosecuted as co-conspirators. Everything you hope to build gets destroyed, and you end up worse than where you started. Maya absorbed this. Let the fear of it wash through her without taking root. I've been afraid my whole life. Afraid of losing my job. Afraid of medical bills. Afraid of landlords and bill collectors and every system designed to extract from people with nothing left to give. This fear feels different. At least I'm afraid while doing something that might actually change our trajectory. Marcus smiled with something like respect. Your uncle would have liked you. He spent 15 years afraid in exactly that way. Afraid, but acting anyway. The loading happened at night, away from attention that daylight operations would attract. The provisions were standard enough that no one questioned their purpose. Food and water for a crew of 4. Fuel that matched the Esperanza's tank capacity. Basic safety equipment that coastal transit required. But hidden among the legitimate supplies were items that told different story. Satellite phones, encrypted for communications that didn't want monitoring, GPS units configured for routes that avoided standard shipping lanes, currency counters, and verification equipment for the transfer that would happen in international waters. The money itself remained sealed in its compartment, Raphael's hiding place proving adequate for one more journey. They would extract it only when safely beyond U.S. jurisdiction, when the risk of inspection had diminished to levels that made exposure manageable. Maya spent the final night before departure in the captain's quarters, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that made her bones ache. She reviewed the routing one more time, memorized contingencies, prepared for failure modes that could still be survived if they maintained discipline and luck held. The offshore accounts were established. Shell corporations existed in appropriate jurisdictions. Contacts in the Cayman Islands waited for cargo that would begin arriving in batches over the following weeks. The infrastructure was ready. The ship was ready. The crew was ready. The only uncertain variable was her own nerve, and that would be tested starting at dawn. Her phone showed messages from Lily, photos of drawings the girl had made, stick figures labeled Mama and Me with hearts and flowers, and the uncomplicated optimism of childhood. Maya saved each image, backed them up to cloud storage, created permanent record of her daughter's love in case something went wrong, and these artifacts became all that remained of their relationship. Melodramatic, perhaps, but she was hours from committing crimes that could separate them permanently, so melodrama felt appropriate. Marcus arrived at 5 in the morning, carrying coffee, an expression of someone who'd spent the night in similar wakeful anxiety. The crew's on board, Robertson's running final systems checks, tides optimal in 90 minutes. You ready? Maya thought about every choice that had led here. The divorce that had stolen stability, the automation that had eliminated her career, the medical bills that had consumed savings, the eviction notice that had catalyzed desperation into action. The letter about Raphael's ship arriving exactly when she needed impossible option. The hidden fortune waiting exactly long enough for her to find it. The compression of timeline forcing decision before doubt could accumulate into paralysis. Ready felt like the wrong word. Committed. Terrified. Out of alternatives. But ready? She'd probably never be ready for something like this. Let's go, she said instead, and followed him to the deck where morning light was just beginning to illuminate Long Beach Harbor and the city beyond, where Lily slept safe with Elena, where legitimate life continued for people who'd never have to make choices this desperate or dangerous. The engines rumbled to life with sound that felt like point of no return. Diesel roar announcing to anyone listening that the derelict MV Esperanza was moving for the first time in 15 years. Robertson stood at the helm with the calm competence of someone who'd navigated worse vessels through more dangerous waters. His crew worked lines and prepared for departure with efficiency that came from experience. Maya stood beside Marcus on the deck, watching the salvage yard slip away as the ship began its ponderous movement toward the harbor mouth. The reality of it hit with physical force. She was doing this, actually attempting the impossible thing that should have remained fantasy, actually betting everything on one voyage that would either transform their lives or destroy them completely. The city looked different from the water, perspective shift that made familiar landscapes alien. Buildings she'd passed countless times on buses and streets revealed themselves as backdrop to maritime world she'd only understood abstractly despite years in logistics. This was where cargo moved, where global commerce happened, where ships carried the components of modern life between ports in patterns so vast that individual vessels barely registered. The Esperanza joined that pattern, become one more shape among dozens moving through the harbor, distinguishable only to those who knew to look for the rust and disrepair that marked her as different. The Coast Guard station passed to starboard, its vessels tied at docks, their crews visible but inattentive to civilian traffic that moved according to expected rhythms. Maya's pulse spiked with each glimpse of authority, certain that somehow they knew that investigation had already begun, that interception was imminent. But nothing happened. They continued past the station, past the harbor defenses, past the last markers that designated U.S. control waters. International maritime law placed the boundary at 12 nautical miles from shore. That became their first objective, the line beyond which U.S. jurisdiction became complicated enough that simple boarding and search required justifications that routine patrol wouldn't provide. Robertson pushed the Esperanza to maximum safe speed, which proved disappointingly slow given the vessel's age and condition. 8 knots, he announced, checking instruments that were more hope than reliable technology. At this rate, we're 5 hours to international waters. Longer if we encounter any complications. The morning passed in tense monotony, ocean stretching empty around them, Los Angeles disappearing astern, horizon offering nothing except water and sky and variations of blue. Maya forced herself to eat, knowing that nausea was partly fear and partly seasickness from someone unaccustomed to vessel movement. But nutrition would matter if crisis demanded physical stamina. Marcus remained on deck, scanning horizon with binoculars, watching for the Coast Guard cutters or customs vessels that might decide the Esperanza's departure merited inspection. But the sea remained clear, traffic sparse enough that their isolation felt protective rather than exposing. 3 hours out, the ship's satellite phone buzzed with incoming call. Robertson answered, his half of the conversation revealing nothing except coordinates and confirmation. The transfer vessel's on schedule, he reported after disconnecting. They'll reach the rendezvous point 6 hours ahead of us. Wait for our arrival, complete the cargo swap, and everyone gets paid. Maya nodded, unable to trust her voice, watching the GPS tick down distance to the point where everything would change. 12 nautical miles became 11, then 10, the numbers decreasing with agonizing slowness that made each minute feel like personal affront. At 9 miles, a vessel appeared on radar, approaching from the south. Robertson's expression tightened. Could be nothing. Probably is nothing. But we watch. The vessel maintained its course, passing within 2 miles without altering trajectory or making contact. Probably commercial traffic heading to San Diego. Robertson relaxed fractionally. But that's going to happen. This is shipping lane. We'll see dozens of vessels before we reach international waters. Stay calm. Easy to say, harder to execute when every unknown contact felt like threat. Maya's hands gripped the rail with force that made her knuckles white, knees locked to prevent shaking that threatened to visible. 7 miles. 6 miles. The boundary approaching with geological patience. Each tenth of a mile earned through engine vibration and fuel consumption and the slow defeat of distance. 5 miles. Robertson made course adjustment, angling slightly west to account for current that was pushing them east of optimal route. The engines protested the change, but complied, their reluctant power just barely adequate to maintain headway against Pacific's endless movement. For miles. Marcus's phone buzzed with encrypted message. They came in contact confirming readiness, asking for estimated arrival. Everything downstream was prepared, waiting for cargo that would begin transformation from physical currency to wire transfers to investment vehicles to accessible funds. The pipeline was ready. They just needed to survive the next few hours. 3 miles. Radar showed another contact, this one larger, moving faster, trajectory that would intersect their course if both vessels maintained speed. Robertson studied the return, expression unreadable. That's bigger than commercial. Could be military, could be Coast Guard cutter. We maintain course and speed. Any deviation might draw attention. The vessel resolved on horizon. White hull with distinctive orange stripe that confirmed Robertson's assessment. Coast Guard cutter definitely coming this way. Could be routine patrol, could be specific intercept. We're about to find out which. Maya felt her breakfast threaten return, forced herself to breathe through panic that demanded action when action would only confirm suspicion. The cutter altered course slightly, coming directly toward them now, purpose clear even at distance. Robertson's jaw set with determination. They're going to hail us. I'll handle communication. Everyone else stays below, out of sight, looking like normal crew. We're a coastal transit vessel doing exactly what our authorization permits. Nothing unusual, nothing to justify boarding. The cutter closed distance with speed that made the Esperanza's progress look stationary by comparison. Modern engines and sleek hull design demonstrating everything that had changed in maritime engineering since 1987. Within 20 minutes, it pulled alongside, close enough that Maya could see individual crew members, close enough that the officer using the loudspeaker was clearly visible. Motor Vessel Esperanza, this is U.S. Coast Guard. Please identify yourself and state your destination. Robertson keyed the radio, his voice steady and professional. This is Motor Vessel Esperanza, Captain Robertson commanding. We're en route to international waters for sea trials following repair work. Operating under coastal transit authorization. All documentation is current. The pause felt eternal, silence broken only by engine noise and wave action against the hull. Then the response came, carrying skepticism that made Maya's chest tighten. Esperanza, we show your vessel has been inactive for 15 years. Request permission to board and verify seaworthiness. This was it, the moment where everything could end, where boarding party would discover the hidden compartment and $380 million in federal charges would follow. Robertson glanced at Maya, question in his expression. She could refuse boarding, which was her right in international waters, but would guarantee pursuit and eventual forced compliance. Or she could consent, gambling that the compartment's concealment would survive inspection that wasn't specifically searching for hidden cargo. The choice was impossible, both options carrying catastrophic risk. But refusing guaranteed suspicion. Consenting at least offered chance that routine inspection would miss what more thorough search would eventually find. She nodded fractionally, giving permission that might destroy everything. Robertson keyed the radio. Permission granted. We're standing by for boarding party. The cutter maneuvered alongside, its crew executing approach with practiced efficiency. For personnel transferred to the Esperanza, led by a lieutenant whose expression suggested he'd conducted thousands of inspections and developed instincts about which vessels merited suspicion. His eyes swept the deck, cataloging details, assessing crew, measuring what he saw against what he'd expected to find. Captain Robertson, I'm Lieutenant Reyes. We're going to conduct a brief safety inspection. This is standard procedure for vessels returning to service after extended dormancy. The inspection began on deck, Lieutenant Reyes examining safety equipment with the methodical attention of someone trained to identify violations that justified deeper scrutiny. Life preservers, fire extinguishers, navigation lights. each item assessed against regulations that the Esperanza barely met through Marcus's hurried preparations. The crew's documentation came next. Licenses and certifications that Robertson had secured through channels Maya didn't question because ignorance provided deniability she might need later. Lieutenant Reyes studied the paperwork with expression, suggesting he'd found discrepancies, but nothing egregious enough to warrant immediate action. The coastal transit authorization checked against the vessel registry, his tablet displaying information that made his eyebrows rise slightly. This ship was seized in 2010, sold at auction to Rafael Santos for $1. You're claiming ownership based on inheritance from Santos? Maya stepped forward, her voice steadier than her hands. Yes, Lieutenant. Rafael was my uncle. He passed 6 months ago. I'm his sole heir. The ship has been in salvage yard since seizure. We've just completed minimum repairs to move her to a facility where proper restoration can proceed. The explanation was technically true, which made lying easier. Reyes nodded slowly, processing information against whatever pattern recognition his training had developed. And the destination is international waters because... Sea trials, Robertson interjected. We need to test engines under load, verify hull integrity under realistic conditions. Coastal waters don't provide adequate testing environment. Running her out 12 miles and back gives us baseline data for what additional work is needed. The justification sounded plausible to Maya's ears, but Reyes's expression remained skeptical. He gestured toward the companionway, leading below deck. I'd like to inspect the interior. Standard procedure. Maya's pulse spiked with adrenaline that made her vision narrow. The interior meant cargo holds, meant crew quarters, meant potentially the captain's suite where $380 million waited behind false bulkhead that had survived 15 years of concealment but might not survive Coast Guard inspection. She had no legitimate reason to refuse, no grounds to deny access, nothing except the certain knowledge that discovery meant catastrophe. Of course, Lieutenant. Robertson will escort you. She watched them descend, Marcus beside her, both frozen in moment that felt suspended between outcomes. Either the compartment would hold its secrets or it wouldn't. Either Reyes would conduct routine inspection or he'd find reason to search thoroughly. Either they'd sail away in an hour or they'd be in federal custody before sunset. The minutes stretched like torture, each second carrying weight of everything, depending on luck and Raphael's craftsmanship, and the simple probability that inspectors looking for safety violations wouldn't notice architectural anomalies that required specific knowledge to recognize. Maya forced herself to breathe normally, to project the bored patience of someone watching routine bureaucracy rather than the barely contained panic of someone with fortune in contraband hidden meters away. Marcus's hand found hers, squeeze providing anchor to present moment. He's looking for safety violations, not smuggled cargo. Unless he has specific intelligence, he's checking equipment and documentation. The compartment survived customs inspection in 2010. It'll survive this. The confidence in his voice didn't match the tension in his grip, but Maya appreciated the attempt at reassurance. Below deck, she could hear movement, voices discussing bilge pumps and electrical systems, the ordinary language of maritime inspection. Nothing sounded alarmed. Nothing suggested discovery. 10 minutes became 15, then 20. The inspection was thorough, more comprehensive than the brief check Reyes had initially suggested. Maya's imagination supplied scenarios where suspicion had sharpened into investigation, where Reyes had noticed something wrong, where even now he was radioing for backup and preparing to place everyone under arrest. Then footsteps on the companionway, Robertson emerging first, followed by Reyes, whose expression revealed nothing except professional completion of assigned task. The vessel meets minimum safety standards for coastal transit, he announced. I'm noting several deficiencies in my report that will require remediation before any extended voyage. The bilge pumps are undersized, navigation equipment is outdated, and hull corrosion exceeds recommended limits for vessels in regular service. But for limited sea trials within sight of shore, you're authorized to proceed. Maya felt tension drain so completely that her knees threatened to buckle. He'd missed it. The inspection had been thorough enough to be credible, but not thorough enough to discover hidden compartments that weren't part of standard search protocol. They were clear. They could continue. "Thank you, Lieutenant. We appreciate your diligence." Reyes studied her with expression that suggested he was still processing something that didn't quite align with his expectations. "Ms. Torres, can I offer some advice?" Off the record, the shift to informal communication felt dangerous, but refusing would seem suspicious. "Of course. This ship is a liability. I've seen the documentation. 43,000 in docking fees, 78,000 in disputed creditor claims, repair costs that are going to exceed the vessel's value. You're throwing money at something that should go to scrap. Whatever sentimental attachment you have to your uncle's property, it's not worth the financial burden you're assuming." The concern seemed genuine, which made it harder to dismiss. But Maya had committed too completely to turn back based on practical advice that ignored the 380 million reasons she was making impractical choices. "I understand your concern, Lieutenant, but some things matter beyond financial calculation. This was my uncle's ship. I want to honor his memory by giving it one more chance." Reyes nodded with the resignation of someone who delivered warnings to people who wouldn't heed them. "Your choice. Safe voyage, Ms. Torres." The boarding party transferred back to the cutter with practiced efficiency, the larger vessel pulling away and resuming its patrol course. Within minutes, it had disappeared over the horizon, leaving the Esperanza alone with ocean and sky and the 12-mile boundary that was now less than 2 miles distant. Robertson exhaled loudly, hands shaking slightly as adrenaline crash caught up with performance anxiety. That was closer than I'd like. He was suspicious. Didn't have grounds to search thoroughly, but he knew something was off. We got lucky. Maya watched the cutter's wake dissipate, white foam dissolving into Pacific blue. How close were we to him finding the compartment? Robertson's expression turned grim. He walked right past it twice, stood in the captain's quarters looking at walls while I explained the layout. If he'd had specific intelligence, if he'd been looking for hidden cargo instead of safety violations, he'd have found it. We survived because he wasn't searching for what we're carrying. Next time we might not be that fortunate. There won't be a next time, Maya said with certainty that surprised her. We cross into international waters, we complete the transfer, and this ship never returns to U.S. jurisdiction. One voyage. That's all we need. The final miles to international waters passed without incident. The boundary crossing marked only by GPS coordinates rather than any visible change in ocean or sky. But the significance was profound. They'd moved beyond U.S. Coast Guard jurisdiction, into waters where pursuit required different justifications, where boarding demanded international protocols, where the simple fact of distance provided protection that proximity to shore couldn't offer. Robertson adjusted course to match the coordinates where transfer vessel waited, his navigation calculations accounting for current and wind and the Esperanza's limited speed. 6 hours to rendezvous, he announced. Weather's holding, seas are moderate, engines are stable. We should make it without complications. Should, Maya noted the qualifier. But not guaranteed? Nothing's guaranteed on a vessel held together with patches and prayer. We're operating beyond recommended safety margins. Every hour we stay afloat is minor victory against probability. The afternoon stretched into evening, sun tracking across sky an arc that measured time through shadow and light. Maya retreated to the captain's quarters, needing space from the deck and crew and the endless ocean that made isolation feel absolute. Raphael's photographs watched from the walls, his younger self smiling in images that predated whatever choices had led to $1 ship purchase and 15 years of protective silence. She wondered what he'd think of this voyage, whether he'd approve of the risk she was taking or warn her away from dangers he'd spent his life trying to avoid. The journal sat where she'd left it, Raphael's handwriting documenting obsession that had consumed his final years. She read entries she'd skipped before, finding details that made the man more real. His love of dawn watch, the satisfaction he took from maintaining engines that no longer ran, his hope that eventually someone would understand what he'd preserved and why it mattered. He'd known the money was criminal proceeds. That much was clear from entries that referenced the previous captain's smuggling operation and the customs seizure that had interrupted it. But Raphael had also believed that wealth extracted from corrupt systems could be repurposed for legitimate needs, that money's origins mattered less than its ultimate use. The compartment called to her with gravity she couldn't ignore. Maya opened the false panel, removed one bundle of currency, unwrapped it to confirm reality of what they were carrying. The bills felt ordinary, worn from circulation, bearing no obvious marks that distinguished them from legitimate money. But their presence aboard this vessel, concealed and undocumented, transformed them into contraband that could justify prosecution. She rewrapped the bundle, returned it to position, sealed the compartment. Tomorrow the transfer would happen, and this cargo would become someone else's problem to legitimize. Her role would shift from smuggler to recipient of investment returns, from criminal to merely complicit in crimes conducted at sufficient distance to provide deniability. The distinction felt meaningless, but legal systems thrived on such distinctions, transforming proximity into culpability or distance into innocence through arbitrary lines that determined who faced consequences. Marcus found her there as evening deepened toward night. "The crew's eating dinner such as it is," he said. "You should join us. Maintain normalcy even when nothing about this is normal." The galley had been provisioned with simple fare, sandwiches and coffee and energy bars that provided calories without requiring cooking in kitchen that hadn't functioned in 15 years. The crew ate in silence, broken only by Robertson's occasional updates about weather patterns and navigation adjustments. They were professional enough not to discuss cargo or purpose, maintaining fiction that this was routine maritime transit rather than criminal conspiracy. After dinner, Maya tried calling Lily, needing to hear her daughter's voice, but satellite connection was intermittent and call quality degraded to unusability. She settled for text message instead, simple words that carried more weight than their brevity suggested. "Thinking of you, baby. Almost done with work. Love you so much." The response came minutes later, dictated to Elena's phone since Lily couldn't type efficiently yet. "Love you too, Mama. Sophie and I made cookies. When you come home, can we make cookies together?" The normalcy of it, the simple request for future activity that assumed everything would work out fine, made Maya's chest tighten with emotion she couldn't afford while maintaining composure the crew needed to see. "Yes, baby. Why come home? We'll make all the cookies you want." The night watch fell to Robertson and one crew member, leaving Maya and Marcus to attempt sleep in quarters that offered bunks but not comfort. The ship's movement had intensified as they moved into deeper water, swells making the deck rise and fall with rhythm that turned stomachs and prevented rest. Maya lay in darkness, listening to the engine's labor. Hull Creek, ocean remind her that they were small and vulnerable in an environment that granted no mercy to mistakes. Sleep came eventually, fitful and populated with dreams where Coast Guard cutters multiplied in a fleet that surrounded them, where Lily called asking why Mama wasn't coming home, where Raphael appeared to ask whether she understood what she'd taken on and whether she was strong enough to see it through. She woke before dawn to find Marcus already on deck, watching horizon where first light was beginning to distinguish ocean from sky. "The transfer vessel should be visible soon," he said without preamble. "They'll approach from the west, match our speed, come alongside for cargo swap. Whole operation should take less than an hour if everything goes smoothly. And if it doesn't go smoothly, then we improvise." Robertson joined them, coffee in hand, face showing exhaustion that matched Maya's own. "But my contact assures me these people are professionals. They've conducted dozens of transfers like this. They know what they're doing." The vessel appeared as sun broke horizon, silhouette resolving into a medium-sized cargo ship that looked significantly more seaworthy than the Esperanza. It approached with confidence that spoke of modern engines and competent crew, maneuvering alongside with precision that made their own passage look amateurish by comparison. The captain of the transfer vessel introduced himself via radio as simply Chun, voice-carrying accent that suggested Asian origin but perfect English fluency. "We're ready to receive cargo," he stated without preamble. Prepare for alongside transfer. We'll maintain position for 60 minutes. After that, we depart regardless of completion status. The timeline was clear, the pressure explicit. Maya and Marcus descended to the captain's quarters for the final time, opened the compartment that had protected its secrets across 15 years and one final voyage. The bundles of currency filled duffel bags they'd brought specifically for this purpose, each bag holding $10 million, each one requiring 2 people to lift safely. 38 bags total, weight that tested their strength and stairway that hadn't been designed for this kind of load. The crew formed chain, passing bags from below deck to main deck to the transfer vessel, whose crew received them with professional efficiency. No one commented on contents or asked about source. This was transaction, cargo moving from one vessel to another, documentation that would be created later in forms that bore no relationship to reality. The work was exhausting, physically demanding in ways that made Maya's retail job look easy by comparison. 38 trips up and down stairs, 38 bags transferred across gap between vessels that ocean swells made variable and dangerous. Her shoulders burned, her back protested, her hands developed blisters that broke and bled, and kept working because stopping was an option until completion. 45 minutes into the transfer, 28 bags delivered. Chen's voice came over radio with urgency that made everyone freeze. Vessel approaching from the east. Unknown configuration. Appears to be government or military. Recommend we accelerate. Maya's pulse spiked with panic that threatened to overwhelm functional thought. They'd come so far or so close to completion, and now interference threatened everything. How many bags left? 10, Marcus gasped, his own exhaustion obvious. We can do 10 bags in 15 minutes if we don't stop. Robertson was already on radio, coordinating with Chun, both vessels maintaining formation while crews worked with renewed desperation. The bags moved faster now. Safety protocols abandoned in favor of speed, risks accepted because discovery would make injuries irrelevant compared to prosecution. The approaching vessel resolved on radar, configuration that Robertson identified as possible Coast Guard cutter or naval patrol. Distance was difficult to estimate, but closure rates suggested they had maybe 20 minutes before it arrived within visual range. Bag 29 went across, then 30, 31. The rhythm was frantic now, muscles screaming, lungs burning, adrenaline providing energy that should have been depleted hours ago. 32, 33, 34. The approaching vessel was definitely coming toward them, trajectory too precise to be coincidence. Someone had identified their presence and decided investigation was warranted. 35, 36, 37. One bag remaining. The last $10 million of $380 million. Maya grabbed it with Marcus, carried it upstairs that felt steeper than before, passed it across the gap to Chen's crew, who secured it with others. Transfer complete. Chen's voice came over radio. Departing now. Good luck. The transfer vessel's engines roared to full power, accelerating away with speed that demonstrated everything the Esperanza lacked. Within minutes, it was disappearing toward the horizon, carrying cargo that represented Maya's entire future, leaving them aboard a barely functional vessel, facing investigation that could still destroy everything despite successful transfer. Robertson studied the approaching vessel through binoculars, expression grim. That's U.S. Navy patrol boat. Fast, well-armed, definitely coming to check us out. We can't outrun it, can barely maintain current speed. We're about to have very uncomfortable conversation. What do we tell them? Maya's mind raced through options, scenarios, lies that might survive scrutiny. The truth minus the cargo. We're conducting sea trials on a recently inherited vessel. The transfer ship was providing navigational assistance. Nothing illegal about 2 vessels communicating in international waters. Robertson's skepticism was visible. They're going to ask why navigational assistance required hour-long, alongside operation. We need better story than that. The patrol boat closed distance with inexorable efficiency, modern military hardware demonstrating capabilities that made civilian vessels look stationary. Within 15 minutes, it had pulled alongside, loudspeakers demanding identification and explanation for activities that appeared suspicious. Robertson responded with the Coastal Transit Authorization story, the sea trials explanation, the claim that transfer vessel had been providing technical consultation about engine performance. The lies sounded thin even to Maya's ears, desperation disguised as legitimate activity. The Navy lieutenant who commanded the patrol boat wasn't buying it. His voice came over radio with flat authority that suggested he'd heard every possible deception. Motor vessel Esperanza. We're going to board and inspect your vessel. Maintain current heading and speed. Any attempt to evade will be considered hostile action. This was catastrophic, the scenario they tried so hard to avoid. The cargo was gone, successfully transferred, but the captain's quarters still held evidence of the compartment, still showed signs of recent heavy traffic, still contained documentation that careful inspection would recognize as suspicious. Maya looked at Marcus, at Robertson, at the crew who'd committed crimes alongside her and now faced consequences. "We're in international waters," she said desperately. "You don't have jurisdiction to board without probable cause." The lieutenant's response came immediately. "We have probable cause. Your vessel engaged in a alongside transfer operation with ship that fled when we appeared. That's suspicious behavior justifying inspection under international maritime law. Prepare for boarding party." The Navy crew transferred with military precision, 6 personnel armed and professional, conducting search that was far more thorough than Coast Guard inspection had been. They swept the deck, examined the cargo holds, questioned crew members separately to check for story inconsistencies. And then they descended to the captain's quarters where Maya waited with Marcus, both knowing that discovery was likely, that their improbable success was about to transform into equally improbable failure at the final moment. The lead inspector, a chief petty officer named Williams, examined the quarters with suspicious eyes that had been trained to recognize concealment. He studied the walls, tapped bulkheads, measured interior space against exterior dimensions, found the discrepancy that careful observation would always reveal. This wall, he indicated the section where the compartment was hidden, interior dimension doesn't match exterior. There's dead space here that shouldn't exist on a vessel this design. Explanation? Maya forced herself to meet his gaze, to project innocence she didn't feel, to manufacture a lie that might create doubt. "My uncle made modifications. Storage, I think. The ship was his home for years. He customized the space." Williams produced a pry bar from his equipment belt, began working the panel edge with professional efficiency. Within minutes, he'd exposed the compartment that had held $380 million until 2 hours ago. The space was empty now, the bundles transferred, nothing remaining except canvas wrapping and tape residue that showed something had been stored there recently. The chief's expression hardened with certainty. "This is a concealment compartment. Professional construction, designed specifically to hide cargo from inspection. What was in here?" "Nothing." Maya's voice came steadier than a racing heartbeat. "It was empty when I inherited the ship. Whatever my uncle stored there, he removed before his death." Williams didn't look convinced, his training and experience telling him that people who built compartments like this didn't leave them empty. But empty it was, and without cargo to prove smuggling, without witnesses to testify about transfer, without evidence beyond architectural anomaly, prosecution became complicated. The inspection continued for another hour, documentation photographed, crew questioned, the Esperanza examined with thoroughness that found every flaw and violation, but no actual contraband. Finally, Williams regrouped with his boarding party, consulted via radio with the patrol boat commander, delivered verdict that felt simultaneously like salvation and postponement of consequences. "We're seizing your navigation logs and taking statements from all crew members. Federal investigators will want to interview everyone. But without physical evidence of smuggled cargo, we're not making arrests at this time. The Esperanza is ordered to return to U.S. waters immediately under Navy escort. Any deviation will result in forcible compliance." The escort back to Long Beach took 12 hours. The Esperanza's slow progress frustrating Navy crew accustomed to vessels that could make the journey in 3. Maya spent the time in captain's quarters trying to process what had happened, what they'd accomplished, what might still go wrong. The cargo was transferred. That success couldn't be undone. $380 million was beginning its journey through conversion pipeline that would transform it from physical currency to wire transfers to investment returns. But they'd been caught, sort of discovered engaging in suspicious activity that federal investigators would scrutinize with resources that might eventually connect dots they tried so hard to separate. Marcus sat across from her, expression showing exhaustion and concern in equal measure. "The cargo's gone," he said quietly. "Even if they investigate thoroughly, they can't prove what we transferred because they didn't see it. The transfer vessel is registered in Panama. Captain's name is probably false. Tracking them will be nearly impossible. We might actually get away with this." "Might," Maya repeated the qualifier, "but also might not. If they interview the crew, if someone breaks under questioning, if they trace communications or financial records, or any of the 100 connections we created, this all collapses. We're not safe until the statute of limitations expires, which is 5 years for most of these crimes. 5 years of looking over our shoulders, wondering if today's the day investigation catches up." They docked at Long Beach under Navy supervision, crew detained for questioning that stretched through the night. Federal agents interviewed Maya separately, asking detailed questions about the voyage, the transfer vessel, the purpose of the alongside operation, Raphael's history with the ship. She maintained the story Robertson had established: navigational assistance, sea trials, legitimate activity that appeared suspicious only because they'd been nervous about Navy approach. The agents weren't stupid, their skepticism obvious, but skepticism without evidence couldn't justify charges. After 8 hours, they released her, with stern warning that the investigation was ongoing and she should remain available for additional questioning. Elena brought Lily to a hotel in San Diego, where Maya collapsed into reunion that made everything feel worthwhile, despite exhaustion and fear. "Mama." Lily's voice carried pure joy, uncomplicated by adult knowledge of what her mother had risked. "You're back. Did you finish the work on Uncle Raphael's ship?" Maya held her daughter with intensity that threatened to crush small bones, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling heartbeat that represented everything that mattered. "Yes, baby. The work's all done. The ship completed its final voyage. Now we can go home, and things are going to be different. Better. I promise." The hotel room became refuge for 3 days while Maya waited for next crisis, for federal agents to return with arrest warrant, for investigation to accelerate into prosecution. But the crisis didn't materialize. Days passed, then weeks. Marcus reported that the initial wire transfer had arrived from the Cayman Islands, $30 million converted and routed to the Belize Corporation. The conversion was proceeding on schedule, batches of currency being processed and legitimized through networks that had handled questionable money for decades. The infrastructure was working exactly as designed. A month after the voyage, federal investigators closed their preliminary inquiry without filing charges. The report cited suspicious activity aboard the Esperanza, but insufficient evidence of actual smuggling. The transfer vessel had disappeared, likely registered under false documentation, untraceable through normal channels. Without cargo, without witnesses willing to testify about criminal activity, without documentation proving what had been moved, prosecution couldn't proceed. The investigation remained technically open, but active resources were directed elsewhere. Maya received official letter explaining that while questions remained about her activities, no immediate action would be taken. She was free to continue her life, though subject to follow-up investigation if new evidence emerged. The relief was temporary, qualified by understanding that safety was probabilistic rather than certain. But it was enough to allow breathing, planning, beginning to access the wealth that was now flowing through offshore accounts toward structures she controlled. The first legitimate withdrawal happened 2 months after the voyage. Investment returns from the Singapore vehicle, properly documented through shell corporations and trust structures, arriving in U.S. bank account that Maya had opened specifically for this purpose. $50,000, an amount small enough not to trigger reporting requirements, large enough to transform immediate circumstances. She paid off the bridge loan with its predatory interest rate, secured an apartment in a better neighborhood where Lily's school had resources beyond what poverty districts could provide, bought a car that didn't require prayer to start, covered medical bills that had been accumulating toward collection. The spending was controlled, deliberate, always matched to documentation that explained source as investment returns or business income or inheritance from uncle's estate. Maya had learned that spending money was harder than earning it when source couldn't be disclosed, that wealth required performance of legitimacy as much as actual legitimacy. She studied wealthy people's patterns, how they discussed finances, what they purchased, how they maintained the social fiction that their resources came from acceptable sources. Becoming wealthy meant becoming an accomplished liar, and she discovered talent for deception she hadn't known she possessed. 6 months after the voyage, the flows had increased to the point where managing them became full-time work. Maya hired a financial advisor who specialized in offshore investment structures, a professional who asked no questions about source and provided expert guidance on tax optimization and wealth preservation. The advice was the same regardless of whether money came from legitimate business success or criminal smuggling. The wealthy protected their resources using identical techniques. A year after the voyage, Lily's trust fund held $2 million, properly structured to provide for education and future needs without creating tax implications that would trigger investigation. Maya's own accounts showed balances that made retail work absurd, yet she maintained employment for another 6 months because sudden lifestyle change would raise questions that neighbors and acquaintances might discuss with wrong people. The Esperanza was scrapped 18 months after its final voyage, sold for parts that brought $12,000 to creditors who'd filed claims against Raphael's estate. Maya attended the scrapping with Marcus, watching the vessel that had carried impossible fortune get cut apart by industrial equipment that reduced decades of maritime history to recyclable metal. It felt like closing chapter, ending story that had begun with $1 auction purchase and concluded with $380 million successfully laundered through systems designed to prevent exactly that outcome. She thought Raphael would have approved, seeing his final gamble pay off for family he protected through silence and sacrifice. The federal investigation never fully closed, remaining open file that occasionally generated follow-up questions that Maya answered through attorney Sandra Kim had become permanent counsel. But without new evidence, without witnesses, without the cargo that had been successfully converted and distributed, the investigation had nowhere to go. Prosecutors had theories but not proof, suspicions but not cases they could win. Eventually, resource allocation logic dictated that active investigation wasn't justified for crimes that couldn't be proven despite everyone involved knowing exactly what had happened. 5 years after the voyage, Maya's life bore no resemblance to the desperate existence she'd been living when the inheritance letter arrived. She owned a house in a neighborhood where poverty was distant memory rather than constant threat. Lily attended private school, where teachers knew her name and education was personalized rather than industrial. Medical care was accessible, comprehensive, never delayed by cost calculations. The wealth had been legitimized through patience and professional management, transformed from criminal proceeds into investment portfolios that generated returns requiring no explanation. She'd become what Raphael had died hoping she could become. Someone who understood that systems existed to be navigated by those willing to learn the routes that connected a legal source to legal destination. Sometimes late at night, when Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, Maya would think about the impossibility of what they'd accomplished. A single mother with $347 and an eviction notice had successfully smuggled $380 million past Coast Guard and Navy, converted it through offshore networks, and established legitimate wealth that would support multiple generations. The audacity of it still took her breath away. The narrow margins between success and catastrophe, the luck and timing and desperation that had combined to make possible what should have remained fantasy. She thought about the other people in her position, the thousands of single mothers working retail while their kids grew up poor, accepting defeat because fighting back seemed impossible. The system was designed to keep them there, to extract labor while providing just enough to prevent complete collapse, but never enough to build actual security. Raphael had understood this, had spent his final dollar on ship everyone else considered worthless because he'd seen what they'd missed and been willing to wait for someone brave enough or desperate enough to claim it. That legacy was what Maya cherished most. Not the money itself, but the proof that ordinary people could beat extraordinary systems when they refused to accept that power equaled immunity from circumvention. The Thomas and Rose Brennan Foundation was established 7 years after the voyage, a charitable organization focused on helping families facing eviction and medical debt, providing resources that government programs didn't cover and that poverty made inaccessible. Maya served as board chair, using her experience to identify people who needed exactly the kind of help she'd needed, providing support that came without judgment or bureaucratic obstacles. The foundation's funding came from her investment returns, properly documented and tax-deductible, wealth serving purpose beyond personal enrichment. Lily grew into a teenager who understood that their comfortable life hadn't come from conventional success, who'd been told enough of the story to appreciate what her mother had risked and why desperation sometimes justified choices that safety would condemn. She wanted to be a lawyer, she announced at 14, wanted to help people navigate systems designed to defeat them, wanted to use education and expertise to level playing fields that wealth had tilted. Maya supported this ambition while feeling the irony that her daughter's legitimate career aspirations had been funded by crimes that lawyers would have prosecuted if they'd caught her. But that was the nature of success in America. She learned legal and illegal wealth were indistinguishable once sufficiently laundered, and moral judgments about source mattered less than practical questions about access and utilization. The statute of limitations for most of her crimes expired 10 years after the voyage, legal protection that transformed anxiety into security. Federal prosecutors couldn't charge her even if new evidence emerged, even if witnesses came forward, even if the entire conspiracy was exposed. Time had granted the immunity that successful execution had only made probable. She'd gotten away with it, completely and permanently, and that knowledge sat alongside wealth as a legacy Raphael had preserved for her. Sometimes she visited Long Beach Harbor, walking the salvage yard where the Esperanza had waited, where the journey had begun with discovery that changed everything. The yard looked the same, filled with derelict vessels that other people considered worthless, potential fortunes waiting for those desperate or brave enough to look carefully. She wondered how many other ships held secrets, how many other inheritances were dismissed because obvious assessment suggested they weren't worth claiming. Marcus had died peacefully at 82, 15 years after the voyage, taking with him detailed knowledge of networks and contacts that had made the conversion possible. Maya attended his funeral alongside maritime workers who'd known him as engineer and volunteer, none of them aware of his role in the largest smuggling operation he'd ever participated in. His daughter, Elena, spoke about his love of the sea and dedication to preserving maritime history, truths that coexisted with criminal facilitation in the way that complete lives always contain contradictions. Lily graduated from college at 22 with acceptance to prestigious law school and plans to specialize in maritime law, the field that had indirectly funded her education through her mother's one desperate gamble. She knew most of the story now, understood the crimes and risks and narrow margins that had separated success from catastrophe. Her judgment was surprisingly absent of condemnation, instead showing appreciation for the impossible choices poverty forced and the courage required to take action when all options carried terrible cost. 20 years after the voyage, Maya stood on the deck of a legitimate cargo vessel, invited guest on container ship that represented everything modern maritime commerce had become. The automation that had eliminated her career, the efficiency that made ships like the Esperanza obsolete, the global networks that moved products with precision her younger self would have admired. She watched the crew work with professional competence, understood the systems they served, recognized how far shipping had evolved since Raphael's era. But she also understood that beneath the legitimate surface, illicit cargo still moved. Smuggling operations still functioned. Desperate people still made impossible choices because systems failed them in ways that made criminality look rational. The Esperanza's final voyage had been one small disruption in vast networks that connected legal and illegal commerce. One successful circumvention of frameworks designed to prevent exactly what she'd accomplished. The fact that she'd succeeded didn't make systems less powerful, just demonstrated that power had limits when challenged by people with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The ocean looked the same as it had 20 years ago, Pacific blue stretching to horizons that promised both possibility and danger. Maya thought about the $380 million that had been hidden in a captain's quarters built for solitude rather than fortune. About the uncle she'd barely known who'd preserved that wealth through 15 years of poverty, because he'd understood that some inheritances required the right heir at the right moment of desperation. About the daughter, sleeping safe in dormitory at law school, funded by crimes that would have sent her mother to federal prison if luck and timing had aligned differently. She'd won the gamble, beaten the odds, transformed $1 inheritance into security that would extend across generations. But the victory was complicated by understanding of what she'd become in the process. The crimes committed, the laws circumvented, the moral compromises that wealth had required. Legitimate success rewarded virtue, supposedly, taught that hard work and honesty led to prosperity. Criminal success revealed that virtue was luxury poverty couldn't afford, that honesty was strategy available only to those with sufficient resources to survive its costs. Maya had learned to perform virtue while practicing vice, to project legitimacy while concealing illegal origins, to become exactly the kind of person she would have judged harshly before desperation taught her that judgment was privilege of those who'd never faced truly impossible choices. The Foundation's latest report showed 300 families helped in the past year, evictions prevented, medical bills covered, emergencies addressed through resources that bureaucracies couldn't or wouldn't provide. The good done with money couldn't erase the crimes that had produced it, but Maya had made peace with the mathematics. $380 million obtained illegally, but used for mixture of personal security and charitable purpose, seemed morally superior to poverty, maintained through rigid adherence to rules that protected wealth rather than people. Raphael would have understood this logic, she thought. He'd spent 15 years maintaining that exact position, preserving ill-gotten fortune because it represented possibility for family that deserved better than the system was willing to provide. The container ship approached Long Beach Harbor as sunset painted the sky in colors that made water look molten, golden light transforming industrial landscape into something approaching beautiful. Maya watched the city where her journey had begun, where the inheritance letter had arrived at exactly the moment when she'd had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from one desperate gamble. The ship docked with modern efficiency, automated systems securing lines and positioning vessel with precision that made human labor seem almost decorative. She disembarked into a world that had changed completely since she'd boarded the Esperanza for its final voyage, technology and wealth having transformed her from desperate mother living in her car into someone who could afford to be guest on luxury maritime tours. The transformation was real, permanent, paid for by crimes that couldn't be prosecuted and success that couldn't be honestly acknowledged. She drove home in a car that cost more than 3 years of her old retail salary, to house that represented security poverty had never allowed, to daughter who would inherit wealth without needing to know every detail of how it had been obtained. The music box sat on a shelf in her study, the one object she'd kept from Raphael's quarters, mechanical melody, still playing when wound. Lily had outgrown it years ago, but Maya maintained it as memorial to the uncle who'd preserved fortune and the compartment that had hidden it in the desperate gamble that had succeeded against all probability. Sometimes she would wind it late at night. Let the simple tune fill quiet rooms. Remember the moment of discovery that had changed everything. $380 million hidden aboard a rusted cargo ship everyone thought was worthless. A fortune that had waited exactly long enough for the right person to find it at the right moment of desperation. An inheritance that had required crimes to claim, but had delivered security that legitimacy never could have provided. The ocean was visible from her bedroom window, Pacific stretching toward horizons that held possibility and danger in equal measure. Maya had crossed those waters carrying fortune that shouldn't have survived the voyage, had beaten odds that should have destroyed her, had transformed desperate gamble into permanent success. The victory was hers, complete and irreversible, protected by time and successful execution, and the simple fact that proving crimes was harder than committing them when planning was careful and luck held. She'd become wealthy through methods that would send her to prison if fully known, but wealth once established became its own legitimacy, erasing questions about origin through the simple power of present possession. Raphael's final gift hadn't been the money itself, but the understanding that systems existed to be circumvented and that ordinary people possessed the capability to do so when desperation provided motivation and opportunity aligned with capability. That knowledge was the true inheritance, worth more than any dollar amount, because it transformed perception of possibility from limited to infinite, from constrained by rules to expanded by willingness to break them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.